If these warning signs got acted on, our world would be a different place.
On April 10, 1912, the much-hyped RMS Titanic left Southampton, England on its maiden voyage to New York. While crossing the North Atlantic, the ship sailed into a field of floating ice, hit an iceberg, and broke apart. Icebergs are huge, white, and usually extremely visible. It would take some doing to miss one right in front of your ship. The Titanic did, but why?
The whole world stood still that night. Once the lights had gone, the ship had gone, the sound had gone. That was dreadful.
2 days after the Titanic sank, taking more than 1,500 passengers and crew along with it, the Chicago Examiner reported that a previous ship, La Bretagne, had received warnings from a Newfoundland lighthouse about dangerous levels of ice in the water. The La Bretagne's captain assumed the Titanic received the warnings, since several other ships had. He also reported that, even without the warnings, the skies were clear enough for him to see the icebergs and steer the ship through them. But it gets worse. Another nearby ship, the Californian, radioed the Titanic to warn them that they were surrounded by dangerous amounts of ice. But Titanic telegraph operator Jack Phillips told them not to interrupt him while he was forwarding messages from the passengers.
It's that idiot on the Californians. Keep out. Shut up. I'm working.
If all or any of these warnings had been heeded, it's entirely possible the Titanic would have made it safely to New York Harbor. On September 9, 1965, Hurricane Betsy whipped ashore at the southeastern tip of Louisiana, destroying the beach town of Grand Isle and flooding parts of New Orleans. There, the water line reached the roofs of some houses in the eastern part of the city. Billion-dollar Betsy was the most expensive U.S. storm to date. She claimed 81 lives and drew attention to the fact that New Orleans, which lies below sea level at the bottom of a geographical bowl surrounded by wetlands, lakes, and a large meander of the Mississippi River, was extremely vulnerable to a major hurricane. This cultural powerhouse, shipping linchpin, and petroleum hub clearly needed protection, but slow, inadequate, and incomplete action doomed many of the city's residents, along with its infrastructure and irreplaceable architecture and cultural treasures.
This is what's left. You know, your whole history is just somewhere under a pile of rubble.
In 2003, a report in Civil Engineering magazine noted that refurbished levees along the city's northern edge would be finished in the next decade, while levees along the curved southern border would need a few more years. That would be too late. On August 29, 2005, Hurricane Katrina made landfall along a path eerily similar to Betsy's, pushing a storm surge into the city that overwhelmed many of its existing defenses. The flooding and subsequent governmental failure to manage the humanitarian crisis left a toll of over 1,800 dead and much of the city in ruins. On February 20, 2003, a fire broke out at a West Warwick, Rhode Island nightclub called The Station. It was among the worst nightclub fires on record, leaving 100 dead and many more injured. The blaze began when the hair metal band Great White made their entrance to the stage. The accompanying pyrotechnics ignited polyurethane foam being used as soundproofing. The flames spread quickly, filling the air with deadly hydrogen cyanide and carbon monoxide fumes from the burning polyurethane. In under 5 minutes, the nightclub was a death trap.
And then before you knew it, the lights went out, and it was all over.
The station had recently passed a fire inspection. On November 20, 2002, Fire Inspector Dennis LaRocque cited the club for 9 minor violations. These were addressed, and LaRocque approved the upgrades during a follow-up visit on December 2nd. However, when questioned later by the Providence Journal, LaRocque said that he hadn't noticed the dangerous foam because he was blinded by anger about a badly installed door that swung inwards, creating a safety hazard. In a particularly bitter irony, the afternoon before the fire, the state fire marshal had publicly praised Rhode Island's fire safety codes, boasting that they made mass tragedies like deadly fires and crowd stampedes unlikely in his state. A bridge should not be exciting. A bridge should be solid and remain relatively still. Bridges shouldn't have nicknames focusing on their wobble. Unfortunately for Tacoma area commuters and a singularly unfortunate pup, the original Tacoma Narrows Bridge was a magnificently bad example of bridge construction. Spanning the waters of the Puget Sound, it opened on July 1, 1940, and quickly received the nickname Galloping Gertie because of its dramatic rocking when exposed to wind. On November 7, 1940, winds of about 42 miles an hour rocked Galloping Gertie so hard that the bridge flew apart in one of the worst structural engineering failures in American history. Authorities managed to close the bridge in time, so the only death was a Cocker Spaniel who was abandoned in a car, though you might credibly ask why a galloping bridge was ever open in the first place. or why anyone would abandon their dog on a collapsing bridge. The collapse was captured on tape, in part because engineers were filming the installation of supports intended to fix the swaying. In 1973, Israel's Arab neighbors were still smarting from the 1967 Six-Day War, in which Israel seized territory from Jordan, Egypt, and Syria, including the much-contested Old City of Jerusalem. Egypt and Israel continued a low-intensity air war until 1970, and as soon as it ended, the Egyptians moved Soviet-made anti-aircraft weapons to the Suez Canal, which at that time was then the line of control between the countries. Israel didn't respond immediately, apparently due to a baseless assumption that the 1967 victory had convinced Egypt, Syria, and their allies that they would lose any further confrontations.
About the only thing Pentagon officials are confident of is that the ultimate victor will be Israel.
That assumption prevailed even after Egyptian President Anwar Sadat's threatened war in 1971, 1972, and third time unlucky 1973. The false alarm strategy worked.
The Israelis were surprised, even though they had seen Sadat move boldly in the first 3 years of office.
When the Egyptian preparations of the summer and autumn of 1973 turned out to be actual preparations for war, Israel was caught off guard. The war began on October 6, 1973, the Jewish holiday of Yom Kippur. The Yom Kippur War lasted 3 bloody weeks and ended in an effective stalemate, with little territory changing hands. The prospect of indefinite conflict led Israel and Egypt to negotiate a peace agreement in 1979, but as even casual observers of the news will know, peace in the region has yet to be realized. In 1960, Canadian scientist Frances Kelsey was working for the U.S. Food and Drug Administration and found something she didn't like. She had been given a file for a drug called thalidomide that was widely used in Europe, particularly Britain, to help pregnant women with insomnia and morning sickness.
A hypnotic, as the doctors call it, that was the answer to a prayer.
Kelsey, who'd only been at the USDA a month but had previous experience testing drugs that could cross the placenta from mother to fetus, didn't think the application for approval was complete. It offered insufficient data about safety or efficacy.
Is there no international clearinghouse for reports on new drugs?
No, there's no such system in use at present.
William S. Merrill Company of Cincinnati, the drug manufacturer, pressured her, but Kelsey stuck to her guns. By 1961, the first reports of side effects had come out. Children born to mothers taking thalidomide were born with serious limb deformities, either flipper-like appendages or none at all. Thanks to Kelsey, U.S. mothers were protected. Canada, which had received essentially the same application at about the same time as the one to which Kelsey objected, did not. Even after Britain and Germany pulled the drug from the market in late 1961, Canada dawdled for 3 more months before yanking thalidomide from its markets. Over 100 Canadians were ultimately born with thalidomide-related birth defects. An advocacy group now protects their interests. Thalidomide was ultimately approved for use in the United States for leprosy. Over a 2-year span from the fall of 1982 to the summer of 1984, journalist Rajkumar Keswani wrote articles warning of unsafe conditions at a chemical plant in Bhopal, a lakeside city in central India. Keswani's sources included employees of the plant and a report on safety conditions commissioned in 1982 by the plant's owner, the American company Union Carbide. The journalist warned that the report found a number of concerning issues, including defective or missing equipment, as well as high employee turnover.
All our fail-safes are compromised.
Pressure gauges were broken, tanks had no indicators of how full they were, and sprinklers were simply absent. As early as 1975, a bureaucrat had recommended the factory be moved away from the highly populated city. The chemical plant wasn't moved, and on the night of December 2, 1984, a huge cloud of methyl isocyanate, a chemical used in the manufacture of pesticides, polyurethane foam, and plastics, along with other chemicals, poured from the plant, instantly killing thousands.
So much suffering from India's invisible killer. At one point, an official said 1 death was being recorded every minute from the poison gas leak in the city of Bhopal.
Eventually, over 20,000 people are estimated to have died from the toxic gas leak, and over 500,000 people were injured and left disabled in the world's worst industrial disaster to date. Union Carbide settled out of court with the government of India, not with survivors, for a relatively paltry $470 million, later selling its India branch to Dow Chemical. For its part, Dow claims to have clean hands as it didn't operate the plant at the time.
The plant that was the source of the Bhopal disaster is still not secure. 30 years on, its chemical waste contamination pits still remain.
Mining produces waste, which might be evident. Not everything you dig out of the ground will be what you want. Unfortunately, for the mining town of Aberfan, Wales, one of the accepted means of disposing of such waste is to stack it in huge piles. By the fall of 1966, a tip or pile of mining waste containing 300,000 cubic yards of debris and rising 111 feet stood outside of Aberfan. Most residents didn't realize it had been placed over a spring of porous rock, but they did know that the rainy autumn had left the tip and everything else saturated, turning the waste into slurry.
It's an incredible sight. The whole mountain is moving again.
On the morning of October 21st, the massive mound of slurry collapsed, sending a wave of watery debris into Aberfan and burying, among other buildings, an elementary school. Tragically, 144 people died. 116 of them school children.
Had the slurry hit hours later, the school would have been empty. It was the last day of term.
A tribunal found it all to have been avoidable. Their report noted that Aberfan regularly flooded, and those floodwaters were visibly contaminated by coal waste. Despite many complaints, a promised retaining wall never materialized. Full responsibility was assigned to the National Coal Board, but charges were never brought against any individuals. In October 1985, Colombian geologist Marta Lucia Calvache Velasco and her colleagues made what should have been a startling report to the Colombian government. The Nevado del Ruiz volcano, located in the north of the country, was about to erupt. While the threat wasn't imminent, with months or years given as a likely timeline, precautions were strongly advised. Unfortunately, for most of the population of the nearby town of Amero, the Colombian government was distracted. The country's long-simmering civil war had again reached the capital, Bogotá. Additionally, no real system existed to transmit warnings to local governments or residents who could act upon them, nor was the Colombian infrastructure able to consistently and effectively monitor the area for tremors that might indicate a large eruption. The volcano didn't wait for these matters to be resolved. On November 13, 1985, it awakened. Some ash had fallen on the town that evening, but local religious leaders and the fire department had urged calm. But the heat from the volcano was melting the glaciers that lay atop it, creating the conditions for an especially fast and dangerous form of landslide called a lahar. A massive lahar was funneled into a narrow riverbed, and the river burst its banks and buried Armero, killing some 25,000 of the 30,000 residents. This horror did at least lead to improvements in Colombia's disaster preparedness. A similar eruption less than 4 years later claimed no human lives thanks to improved detection and warning systems. When Jeffrey Dahmer was arrested in 1991, police spoke to some former neighbors from his home state of Ohio and unearthed a long history of disturbing behavior.
Not because I was angry with them, not because I hated them, but because I wanted to keep them with me.
In one instance, a group of boys had found a dog's severed head on a spike behind Dahmer's childhood home. Other neighbors reported seeing cats and frogs pinned to trees and buildings nearby. Dahmer's neighbors kept this information to themselves for decades, however, and these details only came to light after he was already in custody. But these warning signs were nothing compared to the one missed by police in May 1991. That month, a 14-year-old boy named Conrad Sinthasomphone escaped Dahmer's Milwaukee home. Sinthasomphone was nude, visibly inebriated, and bleeding when a pair of young women found him. Those ladies phoned the police while fending off Dahmer, who insisted that the boy was his drunken lover and that there was no need to involve the authorities. When the cops finally arrived, they simply walked Dahmer and Sinthasomphone back to Dahmer's apartment. After they left, Dahmer strangled Sinthasomphone to death. When this information emerged, protests broke out. Locals claimed that police racism and homophobia had condemned Sinthasomphone to his fate. The officers themselves were briefly suspended, but they continued to defend their decisions in the years to come. There was something inherently unassuming about Gacy that seemed to disarm the communities around him, making it almost impossible for them to suspect him of wrongdoing. But some people nevertheless tried to raise the alarm about him. In 1967, 2 teen boys informed the police that Gacy had plied them with alcohol, forced them to watch pornography, and attempted to molest them.
The face that I saw that night was, I don't know how to explain it. It was just frightful.
Gacy attempted to intimidate them into keeping quiet, but still caught a 10-year sentence on sexual assault charges. He served only 18 months, however, and stepped back into civilian life in 1970. Shortly after his release, another teenager accused Gacy of attempting to sexually assault him. Those charges were dropped after the alleged victim refused to appear in court to testify, which meant Gacy narrowly skirted a parole violation that would have put him back in prison. Even though Gacy had twice faced accusations of sexually assaulting a minor and received a conviction, he wasn't considered a suspect when teens started disappearing in his area. Gacy started killing in 1972, less than a year after his second trial. The cops didn't hone in on him until local complaints led to a stakeout in 1976. The man known as the Night Stalker experienced several traumatic events early in his life. At 5 years old, Richard Ramirez fell off a swing set and suffered a head injury that resulted in several epileptic seizures. While research has linked head injuries with a proclivity towards violence, it's no telltale sign on its own. A more concerning incident occurred when Ramirez was 12. His cousin, a Vietnam War veteran, showed him photos of brutally dismembered Vietnamese women. Ramirez allegedly became aroused by the nightmarish images, forever linking sex and death in his mind. Notably, he later witnessed the same cousin shoot his wife. Ramirez was 24 when he committed his first known homicide, killing a 79-year-old widow. He went on to kill at least 13 people, almost always during home break-ins. He also sexually assaulted many of his victims and left satanic symbols at the scenes of various crimes. In 1985, Ramirez was captured by Los Angeles residents after police successfully worked out his identity.
I am so proud of them. I can't begin to tell you how proud we, all of us, are of the people in this community.
Ramirez died in prison nearly 30 years later. Pyromania is often cited as a telltale sign of a potential killer. And while several known murderers have shown pyromaniacal tendencies, David Berkowitz might be the most prolific of them all. Berkowitz became known as the Son of Sam after he began his spree in 1976. He killed 6 people in total, despite often leaving letters at crime scenes and doing little to evade the law. The police finally caught him after he received a parking ticket near a shooting, and he ended up with 6 25-to-life sentences. During his trial, Berkowitz spoke to a psychiatrist for the defense and shared a handful of stories about his youth. He explained that he had set so many fires as a teenager that other kids called him Pyro. Berkowitz never lost his fondness for flames either. He maintained a diary that linked him to as many as 2,000 arsons in the Bronx. At one point, he even worked as a volunteer firefighter, and yet nobody seemed to realize how dangerous he'd become.
How did you feel when you heard he was the man?
I was shocked. I couldn't believe it. I still don't believe it.
Born in California, Ed Kemper moved to Montana with his mom and 2 sisters after his parents' divorce. His mother, a heavy drinker, frequently abused and berated her son. Kemper slept in the house's basement, distancing him from his siblings and worsening his grudge against his mom. But Mrs. Kemper later claimed she had deemed it unsafe to allow Ed to share space with his sisters. At 10 years old, for example, he began cutting the heads off of his sisters' dolls. Around the same time, Kemper took his first life when he killed the family cat. Kemper reportedly killed another cat 3 years later, displaying its severed head on a platter. These red flags went unaddressed, however. At age 15, Kemper left Montana, returned to his father, and wound up living at his grandparents' house. He subsequently killed his grandparents and spent 5 years in a mental hospital. And even that wasn't the end of it. On his 21st birthday, Kemper was released on parole and placed in the care of his mother. He would go on to kill her, along with 7 more people before finally being brought to justice. Albert Fish is a good example of how easily red flags could be ignored in the 19th and early 20th centuries. Fish's parents put him up for adoption when he was just a few years old, leaving him in an orphanage where the young charges were routinely abused. He soon developed a fascination with suffering, experiencing pleasure from both watching and receiving violent punishment. He would take those interests with him when he left the orphanage and moved to New York with his mother. A decade later, Fish began luring children from their homes and torturing them. Self-harm was always a part of Fish's fascination with violence. He later married and had 6 children, all of whom became witnesses and participants in his sadomasochism. He also frequently stabbed needles deep into his own body and lit himself on fire for sexual pleasure. In total, Fish killed at least 3 people before he was captured and executed, although he was connected to the deaths of at least 7 more. Sentenced to death for the 1978 murders of 2 sorority women and a 12-year-old girl, Ted Bundy maintained his innocence until just days before his execution, when he confessed to 36 killings in a last-ditch effort to save his own life. It didn't work. Bundy died in the electric chair on January 24, 1989, but his story may never be over.
All he said is, "I'd like you to give my love to my family and friends." That was Ted Bundy's last statement.
Today, it's believed he may have killed more than 100 victims, most of whom were children, teenage girls, and college-age women. Bundy didn't fit what we thought was the stereotypical picture of a serial murderer. He was a clean-cut, charismatic, well-educated young man.
He could be the guy next door. Your fiancé, your husband, your boyfriend, your lover.
Looking back, the warning signs had always been there, if only someone had known what they were looking at. At first, Bundy was raised by his maternal grandparents, with his mother pretending to be his sister. She later claimed the father was a mysterious army vet who gave her a false name, then vanished. But according to interviews with family members conducted by Vanity Fair, that's believed to be a lie. Bundy's grandfather was an image-conscious tyrant prone to violent outbursts, though Bundy himself insisted they had a good relationship.
Bundy's grandfather had a real collection of pornography that he was exposed to very young.
There's a theory out there that Bundy was the product of incest, which would explain his grandfather's insistence on raising the boy, but this has never been confirmed. Whatever the truth, Bundy's issues began at an early age.
He liked to scare people.
According to his Aunt Julia, when she was 15, she woke up to discover that Teddy, then just a toddler, has surrounded her with butcher knives. She told Vanity Fair, "He just stood there and grinned. I shooed him out of the room and took the implements back down to the kitchen and told my mother about it. I remember thinking at the time that I was the only one who thought it was strange. Nobody did anything." At an early age, Bundy exhibited the behavior of a potential psychopath. At school, he was intelligent and enthusiastic, smart enough to eventually go to law school, but he was also withdrawn and antisocial. He looked down on his mother and stepfather, whom he considered both poor and poorly educated, and he fought with his classmates who bullied him for his speech impediment.
Even up at Boy Scout camp, he just couldn't quite get the hang of doing the things the other kids were doing.
Of course, there's nothing inherently wrong with being withdrawn or antisocial at school. There are plenty of people who are naturally introverted but perfectly well adjusted. But Bundy wasn't one of them. And it wasn't just the fighting. He liked building tiger traps, covered holes in the ground with hidden stakes underneath. If that weren't enough to raise eyebrows, he was a peeping Tom and a flagrant thief during his adolescence. Around that time, he also developed some darker hobbies. According to his attorney, John Henry Brown, Bundy admitted that as an adolescent, he would purchase mice from a local pet store and take them out to the woods.
Go to the woods and he'd build a little corral, and then he'd decide which one to kill and which one to let go.
Brown suggested Bundy's killing was tied up with a twisted desire to have power over life and death on those around him.
He told me, which I think is somewhat new, that there were many, many times he stalked women and did not harm them.
Bundy's interest in dead bodies foreshadows some of the most sickening aspects of his crimes. In addition to being a prolific serial killer, he was a necrophile who dismembered the bodies of his victims, kept them as trophies, and used their remains for sexual gratification. Still, Bundy managed to maintain a veneer of normality and respectability during his early life. The people around him assumed he was simply an intelligent and academic young man. Sure, the darker aspects of Bundy's youth have been pored over in retrospect, but many of the details only came to light on his own admission. Bundy's crimes were such a shock to those who knew him during his early years that several acquaintances were convinced he'd been wrongly accused. Nevertheless, there are those who claim to have seen Bundy transform from his charming persona into something more menacing. Robin Leary, a fellow student at the University of Utah, recalled a dance at which she noticed a manic stare come over Bundy's face.
I will never forget the look on his face. I can't describe it. It wasn't evil, but it was like he was staring.
Leary found it so terrifying she had her date take her home. Her claim was corroborated by private investigator Joe Alloy, who worked for Bundy's defense team and said that he saw the chilling transformation firsthand. During his time in prison, Bundy admitted that he'd heard voices in the past, and some have suggested that his apparent dual nature was evidence that he may have had multiple personalities. Regardless, he was never formally diagnosed with schizophrenia or dissociative identity disorder.
What's the right way for Ted Bundy to behave to make sure that people get the right impression? Am I going to jump up on the table? Am I going to scream? That's what I felt like doing.
It's possible that Bundy's killing started young, as early as 14, when he was living in Tacoma, Washington with his mother and stepfather and peeping through strangers' windows for entertainment. At the time, an 8-year-old girl named Anne Marie Burr went missing just a few miles from Bundy's home. No DNA evidence has ever tied him to her disappearance, but there are similarities with his later crimes. Notably, she was abducted while her family was at home, and Bundy may have known her through his paper route. Some experts believe none of this was coincidental. Bundy, for what it's worth, denied any involvement. But he is also on record saying that some cases he would never talk about because the victims were too young. Countless abductions and attacks against girls and young women occurred within Bundy's potential area of activity after he came of age. He killed at a ferocious rate, murdering more than 20 women between 1974 and 1978. Quite a few law enforcement agents now believe this may have been preceded by many earlier killings in which he learned to manipulate, incapacitate, and murder his victims without detection. For example, we now know that Bundy lived in the San Francisco area right around the time that the Santa Rosa hitchhiker murders happened. They are certainly in his MO, picking up random girls and doing his thing. Bundy was at one time ruled out as a suspect there, but now investigators are looking at him squarely as a suspect.